Hey there, today we are going to be weaving this woven bracelet. We'll start with our frame loom. This middle piece is just instructions, you can put that aside. One of our colors is going to be our warp thread, which is the thread going vertically across the top and bottom of the loom. So tie on your first color. I'm going to use the gold here. On the bottom left hand side, we've got two options. The first option here is if you're going to do a tie instead of the hardware. So I've got the thread going across the front and back of the loom, but you'll only be weaving on the front. The second option, which we're going to use today, is just having the thread on the front of the loom so that we can use our hardware to assemble it at the end. This is double threaded, so after you go one way across, you're going to loop back around and start doubling up your threads going the other way across. We want to keep an odd number of warp threads here, so I believe I have 5 on there. And it's okay that doubled up, that means 10, which is an even number, but 5 we can use in the groupings. So we'll take our next thread color and just do a plain weave, and that means it's just over one thread, under one thread, over one thread, under, all the way across. So here I'm just putting a spacer in, and that's gonna help me cut my weaving time a little bit, because as you can see, I can just slide my needle through that open shed instead of manually weaving it through for every row. That's only gonna help you on one side. You're still gonna need to manually weave in this next row, but every other row you'll have the spacer. For this bracelet, we're going to do 10 rows of plain weave here, and I'm just going to do a little sampler of each of the techniques, but you can really do these techniques in whatever order you want for your bracelet. Okay, so this next technique is going to be a twill, which means instead of just going over one, under one, we're going to be doing 2 by 2. And you'll notice I started from the right side of my loom and I went over my first 2, under my next 2. And then this next row, I'm going under my first one and over the next 2 so that I get that diagonal going offset by 1 to the right. I'm going to continue this again for 10 rows and just double check every time you go through that your diagonal is still moving in the same direction, and that as you're weaving these, you're keeping it nice and loose. As you can see, I kind of do a 45-degree angle before I beat down with our little beater for each row to make sure that my bracelet is going to stay straight on the sides all the way up. Next is our sumac weave. So grab your gold thread and do a plain weave row, and then we're going to be kind of working towards the left. So I'm going over that first thread, and then I'm looping around my second thread, and you'll see it's going to overlap on itself on that thread. Count over another 3 warp threads and then go under and back that third warp thread. I'll show you close up here. We're counting 1, 2, 3, and I'm going under that third one I counted and back around to the front. And you can see it's already starting a bit of that overlapping sumac weave. So over again 3, grab that third thread, and then pull it tight. And then I'm just going to grab that last thread on the end there. And from here we'll start to turn around. I'm tucking in that tail on the end just because it can get woven in anyway, and that's just another quicker way to do it. So I've looped around that last thread twice, and then the third time I came back around to the front. Then I'm counting 3 over again and looping backwards around it. Now one option here is to just tuck that thread into one of your threads in the back, and then you can just get started weaving by picking up your blue yarn again. And here I'm going under that first warp thread and then over the next 2. And I'm going to mirror my twill this time from what I did before the sumac weave. So now we're going to be leaning to the left. So as you can see, I'm moving to the left of that previous row. That's 10, so let's do another sumac weave, and this time we will start from the opposite side. So we're still going to do a plain weave to get that first row anchored in there, and then we are going to go around again that second thread, count 3 over, and go back and around that one as well, all the way across just like we did before. Now going backwards on this one, I want to show you what it looks like when you grab the same thread that you looped around from the row before. It's going to look slightly different than our previous sumac where we offset it by 1. And you'll see these are more like little triangles, where before it was more like an interlocking braid. We're back to our blue thread, and I'm going to do about 5 rows here of plain weave just to kind of put a little bit of a spacer, and then we're going to do some vertical stripes and then horizontal stripes. These will use both of your needles. It's time to pick up your gold thread and just put 1 single row through, and I'm just going to tuck in this little tail here by actually putting the head of my needle through, slipping my end in, and then folding it down, and squish that in nice and tight so that it doesn't go anywhere. Then you'll pick up your blue thread and do 1 row as well, and you're going to alternate doing just 1 row of each color until you've got the stripes that you are looking for. Push these down nice and tight so that they're really closely packed in. That's really what helps see those stripes. After about 5 rows of each color, you should start to see those vertical stripes starting to form. Now here I'm actually going to start doing our horizontal rows. So I'm going to take that blue thread again, and that will be the second row for the blue thread. Then we're going to do 2 rows of each. So I'm doing my first yellow row and passing it back through for my second yellow row, and I'll do 2 rows of blue, 2 rows of yellow, for again kind of as long as I want those stripes to be. I'm going to do about 5 stripes of colors. You'll see here my ends are getting pretty short, so I'm going to weave in just kind of as much as I can, and then flip the loom over and tuck that end down into my weaving a couple rows. I'm going to do the same thing with the blue because it's so short. I think I'll only get 1 row out of this one, and then I'm going to go ahead and flip it over and tuck it in the same way. All the techniques for this bracelet. So for the rest of the bracelet, you can actually go through and do kind of whichever designs you want. On this last half of the bracelet, I'm just doing a couple different ways of doing things. So you can see, instead of kind of tucking in my tail afterwards, I'm just tucking it in at the beginning. So I'm weaving not all the way across, and then weaving the next row on top of it to secure it. Then here I'm just doing another 10 rows of plain weave. I'll put another gold sumac in here, but instead of weaving in an end, I'm going to actually split my yarn around that first thread so that there isn't a thread to tuck in at the end. towards the end of my bracelet here. As you can see, I have some little markers on the side that tell you small, medium, and large. The next thing we're going to do is pop off these top loops and give them an overhand knot, just kind of as close to the weaving as possible. If you kind of hold that knot with your nail, you can really push it down to be flush with the fell line of your weaving. I'm going to split my middle grouping there so that I have a bit more of even knots all the way across. Once those are all tied and where you want them, you can just give them a trim really close to the knot is what you want, and then we'll flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. So you'll have to trim off that part where you tied on, and then these are going to be a little bit smaller because it was the beginning of our weaving. So instead of an overhand knot, I'm actually going to cut these apart and tie them just as double knots in pairs. This may feel a little bit awkward and tricky, but just take your time and get those ends secured really kind of however you can. It's also important to notice if you are tying a knot on the twill side that you are getting an end from both rows of your twill. You don't want to tie two together where the thread can come apart from each of them. You want to lock those picks, those weaving rows, in between your knots. The last step here is just to add our hardware. So grab a little pair of pliers and your hardware, and you're just going to start by fitting one of those crimps onto the end of your bracelet, making sure it's all nice and even on both sides. Gently crimp down with your pliers. Try not to press too hard here or else it will dent. You'll notice on the other side I did press a little hard and you can see a bit of a dent. It would help if you have a little scrap piece of fabric to push down on. And then your bracelet is all done. You can toss it on, adjust it however you need, and enjoy.